In a world other than Earth, on the continent of Terranor, there will be a prophecy, which would come true once the king's heart disappeared. A mysterious subject would arrive in that land, coming from the current world. It was a legend, also known as the invocation of the transcendent otherworld. The emperor of the Lusclan Empire had sacrificed his 5 sons, 7 daughters, and several citizens, with the purpose of invoking the god of the otherworld of prophecy. But not everything turned out as he thought. A completely naked being had appeared before him. He wondered if it was the one from the prophecy. He felt that he was wasting his time, since the appearance of the subject that appeared was that of a commoner child. A normal 10-year-old boy. From Earth, the emperor was disappointed. He immediately exiled. Arriving in the new world, he was directed to a strange land. Some time passed. In the Laclanium castle, the emperor was having a fight. He invoked the being from another world, a giant snake-shaped demon. He was fighting against a knight, who made a powerful attack with his sword, called Rumbling from the Mountain, manages to cut off the head of the beast easily. The emperor was terrified. Beings from another world were feared in that land, because they obeyed other laws. But that was not a problem for the knight, since he was also a being from another world, invoked by the emperor himself. He was known as the savior of the other world, Sung Sihan. Only those of the Lusclan Empire bloodline could summon beings from another world with magical powers, a small group to be exact. In search of that power, many lost their lives. People suffered terrible events, extortion, and many horrible things. The protagonist, he had experienced a life full of misfortune because of the emperor. Thinking that he had no power, after invoking him, he exiled him. He was practically treated like garbage. He barely managed to survive, and to escape from that place. It took him for many years. He had hoped to return. He only wanted revenge. He had prepared for that moment. It was the end of King Lustenad. He had an enormous accumulated anger, also that of his fallen companions in battle, all because of him, the main character. Through it, he takes the emperor's life, just as the prophecy said. He puts away his sword, and at that moment his companion Lavina arrives. The protagonist is very happy to see her. He was finally able to defeat the emperor. The girl congratulates him. It had been a very long fight. He approaches her and hugs her. It was all over. He didn't have to worry anymore. A life full of happiness awaited her. Apparently they felt more than friendship for each other. But things were not over yet. The king's heart had to be burned. That way they will destroy the remaining monsters. The protagonist's partner didn't think it was possible to achieve victory. He was impressed with the power of Sihan. His name was Lilstein. Immediately after, another of his friends arrives. He heard what they were talking about. He mentions that by burning the king's heart, the protagonist would also disappear. He had been summoned by the king's heart. There was no possibility that he would return to his world. Even so, they will burn the heart of the emperor. At that moment, another of the protagonist's companions arrives. He is surprised to hear that the king invoked his own destroyer. The protagonist was shocked. All his companions were by his side. Lavina asks him if they really had to return to Earth, but the protagonist had already made his decision. All his friends had fought alongside him. He created unthinkable ties with them. He also found love. He had everything he would need in that world, everyone present in that room, if he missed the Earth, but was determined to stay in that world. The most important thing for him was there. However, his companions did not seem to think the same way. Without expecting it, the protagonist is kissed by Lavina. He rushed towards him and surprised him, and the problems would start right there. The environment turns dark, a dimensional portal opens. The protagonist warns all his friends to be careful. Something was wrong. Sihan realizes that the king's heart had been cut out. Despite the fact that the entire Lusclan lineage lost their lives, they had access to the powder from the heart of the king emperor. It was possible to open a portal to the other world. Lilstein had the king's heart in her hand. She tells the protagonist that he had become very strong. He was very popular. He had fallen in love. If he continued like this, he would be the ruler of that world, and his companions did not need another emperor. The protagonist had the potential to become. He had saved the world, and they were grateful for that. But it was time for him to return to the place where he came from. They would take care of ruling their world. Not they could allow a Ferastero will rule over them. Sihan couldn't believe what his friends were saying. They completely betrayed him. He asks Lavina for help, but the girl tells him that this was not the decision she should have made. She did not want to be the wife of a king. He had more ambition. He wanted to be the queen. He was not satisfied with being the prize of a man. When he knew he could have men his prizes, he coldly tells the protagonist that he could not be the price he wanted. He did not meet his expectations. The main character was disconsolate. He did not accept what was happening. His heart had been broken. Lavina approaches, and to prevent him from continuing to suffer, she pushes him towards the portal, so that he would return to the Earth from where he came. After the protagonist vanished in the portal, the world was saved by the hero from the other world and his 6 companions. That was the story they told everyone. The savior had fulfilled his duty, returned home, and I leave a promising future for everyone. It was all the savior wanted. They had overthrown the emperor. The 6 heroes would become the pillars of that land. The new era was about to begin. Those were Lilstein's words to the people, getting the whole world to see them as the true heroes. The taxes and the dictatorships of the emperor were eliminated. That way the 6 kingdoms would work together in the continent of Terranor, bringing peace for a long time. In a change of scenery, a portal opens. On the other hand, in a very beautiful cabin, surrounded by trees and plants, there was a young woman singing, very beautiful. She had blonde hair. It was a warm morning. There was not a single person. Only cloud in the sky, the perfect weather to work in the fields. The young lady begins to do her morning work, and at that moment she realizes that there was a huge fish near her. It was lying on the ground. She gets excited and he gets up, but then he realizes that this animal shouldn't have been there. How it would have gotten to that place? It was something suspicious. He decides to leave it where he found it and continue working in the field, but just at that moment, there is a huge explosion behind from her. A pig had fallen from the sky. The girl wondered what was happening, and she saw how a man fell from the sky after the pig. He hit the ground very hard. He thought he had lost his life, but the boy pulled the head of the earth as if nothing were happening. Gone. The blonde was puzzled by what was happening. She greeted the young man timidly, who was very excited to have returned. He didn't know how many years had passed since his departure, but the happy moment didn't last. He fainted comically. Night falls and the protagonist wakes up. The young woman was just approaching with something to eat. She was shocked to see a man fall from the sky. She wanted to know if he was okay. The boy realized that she was his savior. Everyone her body ached, due to the side effects. At that moment the blonde realized that the protagonist spoke another language. He wasn't from Terranor. It seemed like a language from Austin. She thought it could be from some primitive tribe, but he was in good shape. Conditions to be from there. The protagonist knew that he was not on Earth, he was in Terranor. He asks the blonde where she was. They were north of the Defilan mountain, 12 hours from the village of Gorin. He had not understood nothing, so the blonde decides to explain in detail. First came the territories. There was the kingdom of Lilstein. The country was created by Lilstein, the first hero of the revolution. The protagonist remembered his partner's traitor, who was now king. He asks the girl to lend some clothes, before continuing with the explanation. After eating and dressing, the protagonist notices a slight smell of fish. He assumes it was because of the village where he was. He felt alive again. He thanks the young lady. She is simply speechless. She observed in detail the physique of the main character, and how he behaved. She assumed he was royalty, but she wondered how she got to her humble cabin, also without clothes. He asks the blonde's name. It was Alita. She was a beautiful girl, a field worker. He didn't know whether to give her the same treatment as a warrior, since they were different times, but she had a very well-trained appearance. The protagonist didn't. He was stupid. He realized that from the first moment. She appeared to be a quiet countrywoman, but she was a weapons warrior, or also known as a swordsman. Free people like her do not serve any king. They have no charges. That's why she had decided to take the life of a peasant, farm in her spare time. The protagonist asks her one last question. He wanted to know what her relationship was with King Lustenad. The blonde didn't like that question. She threw the table at him. The main character, without hesitating, took out a dagger and jumped over the table, but the main character had disappeared. He was behind her. He had no intention of fighting. It was just a question. The girl attacks him again, and the main character easily dodges her. He wondered if he was a warrior. The movements weren't normal. She was strong. She continued to launch a barrage of attacks, but she couldn't land a single one, so she decided to increase her speed. The main character was excited. The girl was not as calm as she seemed, but she was a good person. He was not making lethal attacks. He just wanted to knock him down, not take his life. He stops his dagger with a wooden spoon and knocks her down. That way he calms down. He had lost. The main character introduces himself and tells him that he was from Earth. He couldn't believe it. That was the name of the savior from the other world. Apparently they still hadn't forgotten the main character. Alita's reaction was understandable. When asking about the terrible emperor, anyone would have been upset. That guy had hurt many people, but he was just curious. The blonde's full name was Alatirs Bella Lustenad Lusklin. She was the daughter of the old king. The era of the Berserk Emperor had ended. The citizens wanted to eliminate all their relatives. They could not allow another relative to rule. Alita's mother, Serafina, was about to lose her life. She was in the castle. He orders Karen that he will take his daughter and protect her. They managed to escape. Karen had raised the blonde in a place away from everyone, a quiet place. He taught her to fight, but one day she lost her life fulfilling her task as a superior free person. They had discovered her identity. Since then Alita has been living alone. The only way to get out was to do an errand to a nearby town. She had to look for money. After telling the main character everything, she knew that for that reason she lived in those conditions. She had no idea it was the king's daughter, but she did not feel anything towards him. She was no longer in that world, but people were still afraid. Another tyrant with his lineage could take command. There are people who look for the Emperor's relatives and kill them, since they can open the portal to the other world. She thought she was one of those people. The main character keeps up with everything, tries to cheer her up. There were people like him who had come from nowhere in that world, and they were good people. She doubted the main character. She didn't know if everything he said was really true. She had heard that after defeating the Emperor, Sihan had decided to return to Earth. So how was it possible for him to stay in that world? The main character had arrived that way unintentionally, the only way ICO who was beyond dimensions. They were living organisms. He had to live with that shame. The same thing had happened 10 years ago, remembering all that the protagonist did not like. He had returned to Earth, but he was summoned again by someone, or someone had summoned a person from another world, capable of summoning him. It was all very confusing, but actually the protagonist had returned on his own. It was not a task easy. It took him 10 long years. He didn't know how to explain it easily. At that moment the protagonist feels a presence. He remembers that they were persecuting Alita for having royal blood. Sihan had been wrong again. To be able to enter that world from the Earth, magical dimensional pointers were needed in his world. That way he could reach it safely. The protagonist had to use Lusclin's blood relatives, since he could summon the beings from another world. She was the one with the purest blood of all. The blonde realizes that, for that reason she had asked her about her relationship with the Emperor. Basically she was the one who unconsciously invoked him from that world, however that would bring consequences. Besides he had used magic. Just at that moment he got up and looked out the window. He realized that a battalion of warriors was approaching. They were chasing the trail of magic. Everything pointed to Alita's cabin. Apparently they would end the persecution. The tall Zenon was with them. He thanks the Majin clan for leading them to that place. He orders his men to surround the cabin and prepare for battle. Alita equips herself for combat. The protagonist realizes that she was already prepared for that kind of situation. She felt uncomfortable, since she had come to that world for her, and they had discovered her because of her. She would probably be angry, so he asks if everything was fine. Alita was calm, thanks him for notifying him of the surprise attack, leaving the protagonist without a single word. The soldiers ordered them to leave the cabin. When no one came out, Zenon ordered Majin to carry out a light attack to intimidate them, but the old man had no compassion. He cast a fire spell around the entire cabin. They had orders to catch her with life, but it was only a flashy attack. It wouldn't hurt her. If she's not careful, she could get burned. At that moment the blonde leaves the cabin. They would give 10 gold coins to the soldier who caught her alive. Alita begins the attack. He eliminates one of the soldiers. He analyzes the scene and realizes that there were too many soldiers. They had to find a way out as soon as possible. But apparently Zenon wasn't planning to let him escape so easily. He throws his greatsword very hard towards the blocked ground, her running away, calling her a Lusclin mudblood. She had no honor for having eliminated a soldier weaker than her. The Great Knight of Lilstein would fight her. The young man was full of energy through all his armor. He was stronger than the blonde. Barely manages to dodge the first attack, realizes that he had an opening and decides to attack him. He was slower due to his sword, but the attack did not manage to hurt him. Despite having energy in his sword, it was strong, but not enough. Zenon's armor was very strong. He made an attack with his sword again and Alita stopped him, but she was still affected by the impact. She was bleeding. She had broken his arm despite blocking the attack. The subject boasts, saying that a swordswoman like her couldn't defeat him. At that moment the blonde gives up. Apparently she had understood the situation she was in. But at that moment the main character appears. He was angry at the way he treated her. The girl let herself be carried away by her emotions, but Zenon had no idea who he was. I couldn't detect his presence before he got closer. Zenon wanted to know the identity of the main character, but he had nothing against him. He just had to do his duty. So the main character approaches him and gives him a strong blow, sending him flying through the skies. It was incredible. He was buried on the ground when he fell. Alita asks him why he was fighting the soldiers. They were his former companions. The magician yells that the main character was some kind of demon and orders the soldiers to eliminate him. It was a hasty idea for them. Despite the fact that their boss was defeated with a single blow, they decided to attack on the old man's orders. The main character had no choice but to send them flying too. He was giving him what he deserved. They all began to apologize. After a moment, Zenon wakes up and sees all his defeated companions on the ground, some buried in the ground. They were only unconscious. He wondered how someone without weapons would defeat so many soldiers so easily. Just at that moment he remembers those movements. Then, they were those of the great hero Sihan. The protagonist realized that he had woken up and knocked him out again. He stressed that he did not feel any rancor towards them. He could stop fighting at any time. The old man did not give up. He planned to fight against the main character. He had defeated the elite warriors and the Magians easily. In his eyes the main character was a monster. The main character believed that everything was over, and told the blonde to withdraw. The old man reconsidered the strategy. The best thing to do was to withdraw. Since Zenon had fallen, the soldiers that were still standing could help their fallen allies. One of the soldiers told Majin that none of them had been killed. They were just unconscious. The old man couldn't believe it. Then from everything he had seen, they hadn't had a single casualty. He had no idea what was happening. The protagonist enters the forest with Alita. The soldiers couldn't find them in that place. It would be a problem if they followed them. The protagonist's return caused side effects. The protagonist's energy level and mana were below his power original. He wondered how long it would take for him to fully restore his strength. Alita was injured, his arm was broken, however he was lucky, the consequences could go beyond a broken bone. The protagonist did not understand the blonde's attitudes. He helped her by doing an improvised sling, with that he could hold out in the meantime. The girl thanks him, and he would get going. The protagonist got upset in a very comical way, since he thought they were going to travel together. He also had an injured arm. Sihan tries to help her. It was her fault that they found her in the first place, and she couldn't leave her alone in those conditions. That left her speechless. She accepts and stays with the main character. She was very formal with him. She tells him that he could call him by his name. She didn't know what to do, since her identity had been exposed. She tells him that the closest place was Gorin village, but they might be looking for them. It was best to cross the mountain and reach the trade city Kagan. On the other hand, in the kingdom of Lilstein, they informed the lord of the palace that the search party that went to the mountains had news. The king asks what had happened. It was nothing more and nothing less than Lilstein. Lilstein heads towards the basement of the castle. Apparently it had a secret laboratory. Upon arrival there were countless books, test tubes, and also had someone locked up. The subject was very hurt. He was not worthy of calling himself a hero. In the background was evil. He was experimenting with the descendants of Lusklin. The boy had a red circle under it, but it was changing color. It had turned green. The mana transformation was complete. The young man felt ashamed towards him. He didn't deserve to be flattered, but his condition was not the most favorable. They would rip out his heart. He rushes towards him without thinking, and extracts his heart. Having it in his hands while it was burning in fire, he realizes that it was not enough mana. The young man was not direct relative of the king. He needed someone with the strongest lineage to break through the walls of the other dimension. Only someone of pure blood could achieve that. He had already been informed that. The soldiers failed in the mission. They were defeated, rotated by a stranger. He had black eyes and hair. He seemed familiar from the Galan race. That news greatly disturbed the king. The description of the subject was the same as that of the protagonist. But it did not make sense. He alone could not cross the dimensions on his own, and he would also be aware if he was crossed. It was impossible. In a change of scenery, the protagonist and the blonde had arrived in the city of Kagan. Before, it did not usually have that name. The place had changed a lot since the protagonist visited it for the last time. In that place was his main base. The blonde is surprised by that, but it wasn't that crazy. It was the center of commerce. It turned out to be easy for the protagonist to hide. There were many races that visited the city. Among those races there was one in particular of Asians. It was called Galan. They looked alike much to him. Alita had heard of those rumors. The protagonist mastered a technique called Energy of 1,000 Changes, which allowed him to control his energy and not be discovered by the people around him. In this way he approached Sinan without for him to notice. He might even look like another person. It was a technique of the thief Queen Lavina, very similar to the stealth technique. However, that technique was created by the main character, and he taught it to Lavina. He could teach it to she too. That way Anara could hide easily, but she refuses to accept the help of the protagonist. Sihan decides to continue. They had to find a place to stay. Alita really wanted to learn the technique, but she felt embarrassed. They decide to go anywhere. They approach an inn, which previously he was not in that place. It was a gallows. Things had changed a lot since his departure. They were already close to the inn. It was best to go in. He just hoped that no ghosts would come out. If there were, he could recognize several of them. They enter and the man gives them the key to the room. Apparently the man was upset. Alita tells the protagonist that he did not know how to address people. Despite being a hero in his past life, he had to speak formally with the people he just met, but it wasn't the protagonist's fault. It had been a long time since he spoke Austin's language, and in his past life he didn't have to speak formally with many people. He had been rude. But what was really importantly, they were already in the city. So what was the protagonist's next plan? He wanted to adapt. He was thinking of traveling with the blonde for a while. If he didn't have any problems that left her disturbed, the protagonist was very direct. She was not the only citizen in the town. She could look for someone local. She is also wanted, and that could cause her problems. She could not find a logical reason why she would want to travel with her. It could only cause her problems. Sihan is speechless, but she had no other choice. Without the help of the main character, it was almost certain that they would capture her. If she decided to use magic to summon someone from another world, it would cause a tremor, and they would notice. But when the main character arrived, no one noticed. They knew that the world was calm. However, it had left a trail left by the summoners, so every time they move, there will be a small vibration at the dimensional level. Thanks to that, the tracking team will always chase them. That news does not the blonde like me. They practically always had to run away from the soldiers, but all was not lost. The protagonist managed to block the vibrations with his magic. As long as the magic is still active, no one could locate them. The negative part was that he had to do it every 2 or 3 days. For that reason they had to stay together. She needed the main character, but she asked him, because he needed her. In the capital of the kingdom of Lustenad, Delstray, the soldier Zanand was asking for the opportunity to recover his honor. After having been humiliated by the protagonist, he went before the superior in Darwin, hoping to resume the mission and capture his objectives. The superior, he was calm, there was no need to go that far. Not even the king had ordered those responsible for the failure of the mission to be punished. He wanted to return to the field with neophyte troops, instead of being on trial for a long month. The boy had a great sense of honor. He could not forgive himself for what had happened. That made a great impression on the superior. He orders him to continue with his plans and recover his honor. Zanan leaves the room and begins to think about where he could be. I knew that they need money to survive. There was a better chance that they got jobs as free people. Depending on the direction of their flight, they might be in Kagan City, where there was only one place to get job applications. Zanan was smart. With that information he could search for them and locate them faster. He didn't care about the girl, he wanted to check if the main character was the person he was thinking about, the great hero Sihan. I needed to find out. Night falls in the city of Kagan. The Letward butler was receiving Lord Ted. He was about to meet the protagonist and the blonde. For them, they were mercenaries presented by Kaguran. They were free people. They had to change their names to avoid suspicion. They decided to call themselves Alita Relkin and Sean Stein. The protagonist chose that name because it was similar to his. That way, if he is wrong to call him by his real name, they would not raise suspicions. The butler kept introducing them. There were various types of warriors. Some could use fighting energy as a sword hire. They were classified into 6 ranks. The seed rank, they could use energy and improve physical abilities. Warrior rank, he could take a metallic weapon through his hands, create fighting energy, and leave the weapon full of said energy. Most sword hires were born at that rank. On the other hand, those who reach knight rank could use the energy in armor. By mastering the master rank, they can imbue fighting energy into non-metal weapons. Any subject that is capable of mastering fighting energy in the air and being able to materialize a blade-like weapon were known as the superhuman range. There had only been a few in Terranor who managed to dominate are all about fighting energy. They were the strongest of all. They were the upper deity rank sword, just like the main character was 10 years ago, but due to the side effects of the trip, he had used up all his magic energy in combat. Currently he had low energy. He was in the rank of a fighter. It was embarrassing for him after being in the highest rank of all, but that impressed Ted. Since the protagonist was someone young, he was happy with his arrival. The squadron would leave in the morning. They had to rest. Sihan was tired. The work of a mercenary was not easy. Before he would have simply robbed someone rich. But they were different times. The hero of the legend also came to steal. Since the girl he liked was a thief, all the nobles of the empire, they were villains. But things had changed. He had no choice but to kill others and earn money for it. It was the best he knew how to do. The main character sounded like he had lost his mind. He mentions that the mission was to subdue some monsters. Alita tells him that yes, apparently there was a pack of wolves near the Barcelona territory. The squad that they sent to eradicate them failed in the mission. They sent few fighters. Because of that, they decided to send more mercenaries to eliminate them. Wolves could spit fire. 13 years ago, that was the first race of creatures the protagonist faced. He was with his friends trying to eliminate them in the forest. At that moment, the protagonist has bad memories of his past. When they completely betrayed him, he gets angry and decides to change the conversation. Those beasts would serve as a warm-up for him. Since he had lost a lot of fighting energy, he should be able to fight them. The blonde wasn't sure if she had really lost her powers. She was able to beat it with a spoon. She eliminated the search party easily. That was exactly what the protagonist was worried about. He had to need a spoon to defend himself against his attacks. A while ago he wouldn't have even needed it. Despite having low energy, he still had fighting experience. Besides, he was an international winner of 1 versus 1. It was not easy for the protagonist to lose against any subject. The next morning, Lord Ted Knight appointed by the king, he was motivated to defeat the beasts. They had entered his territory. He would take it upon himself to teach everyone a lesson. After that motivational talk for his companions, the protagonist notes that the Lord was armored. He knew they wouldn't be of much help, but at least they could defend themselves with armor. Nothing had changed. The knights were still the same. The protagonist worries about the blonde's arm. He was better. After that, the protagonist healed her. She had improved a lot. The protagonist tells her to get ready. They began to notice the smell of sulfur. The beasts came out of the bushes, a huge pack of ignited wolves, all preparing to attack. Lord Ted, he boasts about defeating them, but comically the wolf makes him shut up, hitting him right in the face. The armor made them slow. They were simple attacks, but they couldn't dodge them. But that was a knight's uniform. They tried to keep the formation till they could win the battle. They had the help of the protagonist. He was fighting against them. When he defeated a few, he realized that they were weak. He could defeat them all by himself, but that could attract too much attention. He couldn't believe they needed so many mercenaries for that mission. At that time, the lead wolf came out of the forest. It was more than 5 times bigger than all the others. All the fighters walk away in terror. The only one willing to face him was the main character. Lord Ted had seen an opportunity. He knew that if they defeated the leader, all the others would surrender, but the captain was a coward. He let the main character and the blonde took care of it, while she went to protect the soldiers. The protagonist ignored him. He knew it would be dangerous. The protagonist tells Alita that he will fight against the leader. He would take care of all the other beasts. He was not planning to run away. They could still defeat more wolves. Alita tries to attack the leader, but the creature spits out a large amount of fire from its mouth. The girl dodges it and manages to cut it with her sword. The beast complained when it was hurt. Alita continued the attack and sticks his sword directly into the head of the beast. While the protagonist watched the fight, he thought he had everything under control, but the blonde's sword got stuck in the skull of the beast, and he was still alive. He spat out a lightning attack all over the body that had left seriously injured and caught it in his mouth. Previously, Sihan answered the blonde's question about why someone like him needed her. The protagonist decides to be honest. He had been summoned in that world thanks to the sacrifice of hearts from the Lusklin lineage. For that reason he was able to stay. Despite the Emperor's plans, however, the new arrival to the world that he had used was not through sacrifices, but through an invocation ritual. The existence of the protagonist in that place was maintained because he was close to his invoker. In simpler words, would return to Earth if Alita loses her life. The protagonist tries to help his partner. He was slow, his fighting energy was very low, there was an imbalance in his powers. He had to wait 10 years to return to that world. He couldn't return in such an insignificant way. The protagonist he motivates and lights his sword with dragon energy. Alita screamed while he was in the lion's den. The protagonist used his powerful attack and managed to defeat the beast. He was very close, both almost lost their lives. He should not be trusted again. Night fell and the young people decided to camp in the forest. Alita was recovering, despite the fact that the wolf bit her. It had no intention of killing her. Most of them captured the humans and took them to the leader. It was the first time they saw a wolf use a lightning attack. Maybe it was some mutation. It was gone anyway. Alita wanted to know how she had ended up being the main character's ally. She didn't know why she was hiding her true identity. On the contrary, her allies had developed 6 kingdoms. He should be treated as a royal guest, but she didn't know anything. The protagonist could be executed if they find him. Sihan tells him what really happened. After assassinating the emperor, all his friends betrayed him. They sent him to Earth. It was fast, but he remembered everything that happened even though it was ago 10 years. He couldn't find the reason for his betrayal. No one seemed to regret it. It was something planned in advance. He was so blinded by his teammates that he didn't realize. The main character, after telling Alita everything, stays watching her. He thought she was processing everything, besides having involved her in such a big conflict. What she understood was that she had returned in search of revenge. For that reason she was hiding her true identity. She had understood everything, but she was very don't worry. The main character was going to have a fight against the 6 kingdoms of Terranor, but they were already his enemies. He was fighting against them before the main character appeared. It was the best thing he could do in his situation. The main character believed that Alita she was very positive. Her father, Karen, also said that about her. At that moment the protagonist feels a presence. Something was approaching them. The boys didn't know if it was an enemy, but it was very difficult for them to be tracked so far. Maybe it was a Bakelran soldier who had stayed behind. They had better be safe. But just before they approached to see what or who it was, the young man kindly approached them to ask for a guide. They were shocked, realizing that he was the captain of the investigation team. Alita gets very upset when she sees him and attacks him with her sword without warning. But the young man had no intention of fighting. The protagonist wasn't sure about that. It was better that he was defenseless. He approaches him from behind and hits him again. He sends him flying through the air. At that moment Zenon knew that his prediction was correct. This time he used his energy to reduce the impact. He had also freed himself from the protagonist's ability, which I have created since he was very young. Not even her classmates knew about her. The boy asks the main character for his true identity, reaches into his backpack, and pulls out a piece of clothing, which he gave to the main character. The main character orders Alita to eliminate him. He thought that he was a simple pervert, but the young man was very nervous. He didn't think clearly what he was going to say. Zenon gives up, and at that moment he realizes that the item of clothing had his name. It was even the main character's handwriting. Such act, he finished confirming to the boy that it was the great Sihan and the savior of the other world. He had always suspected it. The young man remembered it perfectly. The protagonist had saved him in the Varan village 12 years ago. The protagonist was not very sure he remembered. He had defeated all the invading soldiers with great skill and saved him. Then he found out that his savior was the hero of the other world. Over time he learned, and he became sword higher. After that he understood how the protagonist was able to dominate his aura through his body and perform powerful attacks. It was admirable that he could defeat his opponents without taking their lives. The protagonist remembered everything. He simply wanted to test his new ability when he saved him. The boy he saved was 22 years old. The protagonist looked older than him. They were joking with his appearance. The protagonist understood his admiration, but it was no reason for him to be traveling with his clothes in the backpack. But it wasn't the only thing the boy kept. He also had a small statue, a huge collection of books about all his feats, and many other things. But the underpants were an invaluable object. Since he had them used when he defeated the emperor, he had to buy them after saving 6 months. The protagonist was baffled with all that information. He just wanted him to keep that. The only reason why the young Zenon swore allegiance to the king was because he was a friend of the emperor. Hiroshige kneels before the protagonist and offers him his sword, hoping that he will allow him to be his ally. The protagonist asks him what would happen if he became an enemy of the king, but his loyalty now was with him. He would also become his enemy. He felt a lot of admiration for the protagonist. He was being serious. The protagonist had no choice but to accept the king. Boy, he also knew his identity and he couldn't let him leave. He accepted Zenon's sword. The boy was willing to make an effort. He didn't want to disappoint him. He was going to take care of the wolves that were still in the forest. But the main character already he had annihilated everyone, or so he thought. Even the leader's body was nearby. But Zenon tells him that igneous wolves always travel with their partners. They were only attracting the female with the male's body. At that moment, another giant wolf appears before them. It did not cross the mind of the protagonist that there were two leaders in the pack. Alita is surprised at how a veteran in combat like the protagonist could overlook that kind of thing. It is justified with the time he was without fighting. They had been 10 long years. Zenon asks the protagonist to defeat the beast. He wanted to show him his skills. The protagonist accepts the request. The boy stands guard. It was his great debut. He had finally been able to meet the hero of his life. Previously he had been humiliated. This time he planned to redeem himself. An enormous amount of energy emanates throughout his body. The girl is surprised. He begins to fight against the beast. He pushed it with his huge sword, causing it to move backwards. At that moment, the blonde realized. He tells that when he fought against her, he was holding back his true powers. She was very strong for her age, but the boy was on another level. He was very talented. He, on the other hand, was not a prodigy like him. He was only special because of being of the earth. The true prodigy was Lavina. The beast begins to spit fire from its mouth, but the boy places his greatsword in front and manages to cut the flames in half. He jumps very hard to deliver the final blow, and right there, the wolf makes a lightning attack, electrocuting him strongly. He trusted and was defeated just like Alita. He had no idea why a fire wolf would use electric attacks. The blonde wanted to try again, but the protagonist stops her. If the wolf used magic again, he himself would. I was going to order. The reason the emperor was feared was for summoning similar monsters, but magic didn't work on beings from another world. No matter how strong it was, it couldn't hurt the main character. The beast starts spitting fire in front of the main character, but it didn't work. The magic couldn't do anything to him. He had pretended to dodge the attacks before because the other mercenaries were there, but he didn't have to worry anymore. At that moment, the wolf releases another electric shock and manages to hurt the main character. He had been humiliated for trusting himself. That had never happened to him before. He got upset and managed to attack him strongly with his sword. The protagonist was sure that the flames would not hurt him. He did not understand why the lightning had affected him. The blonde was worried about Improta, but he wasn't hurt. The beast had been defeated. He began to fade. They had no idea what was happening. In a change of scene, the boys went to collect their reward. Ted's coward was in the castle, thanks them for completing the task with the beasts, and gives them 600 silver coins as a reward. They collect their reward and leave. It wasn't enough money for the job they had been given. However, to do a single mission it was fine. The main character wanted to accept more missions and obtain more rewards, but they were lucky to get that job. They don't usually appear so easily. Zenon listened when the protagonist says that he needed money. He gives him 100 gold coins. He wonders where he got it from. He has sold the protagonist's underwear, all with the intention of helping him. They joke again with his underwear. The boy wonders what it was their next move. They had enough money. It was not necessary for them to work more than mercenaries. The protagonist did not know which of the 3 countries they would visit first. The best option was to go to the north, to the kingdom of Jexengard. In a laboratory in the kingdom Lilstein, the magician Traden communicates with the king. He shouldn't have done so, but something had come up. The giant wolves that were in the forest were test subjects. Apparently they weren't going to need the service anymore. No one, the Barcelian kingdom, would take care of them. The wolves were not strong creatures. They had also lost the number 1 subject of the tests. This news surprised the king a lot, or rather annoyed him. They were incompetent. The four towers of Magayon had existed for thousands of years, the red, white, black and blue ivory towers. The first emperor was the most powerful magician in history. He had collected all the knowledge of magic and the entire kingdom of Terranor. He left them in the four towers so that a record of their information was left. Said knowledge was classified by classes, so that they learned according to their level, organized in different floors. The best magicians could go up to the upper floors. Each floor represented the magic level of the students. Lilstein was the teacher of the 9th floor of the Red Tower. The only reason Traden became the leader of the Blue Tower was because they were all executed, but the king was thinking of removing him the command. Magicians like him were seen on the 8th floor. He would give him one last chance. He had to take care of subject number 1 and leave no trace. Traden is relieved to know that he had another chance. Meanwhile, in the kingdom of Jexengard, an old landowner goes to the room where his lord was. He was the king of the kingdom of Jexengard Rotenberg, who had organized a party with women. He was having a nice time. He was no longer hunted for the empire. He enjoyed as much as he could. The old man seemed worried about his king. He was avoiding serious matters because he was celebrating all the time. People could start to hate him, but he was not a bad ruler. He celebrated the parties with he did not spend his own money. He did not spend the resources of the kingdom, but in reality the money came from the people he governed. Only a 10% tax had decreased, which the previous ruler did the same as the previous emperor, but in a disguised way. He overthrew the king. He deserved that life. The old emperor was very cruel. They couldn't compare him with him. The old man wanted to continue insisting, but Roten ordered him to withdraw. He had no choice but to leave the room, the king, and he was losing his mind. In the previous war, he had been very helpful, but he was useless to rule. He hoped someone would make him see reason. Roten was having a good time, but the old man put him in a bad mood. At that moment the savior of the world arrives. It was an honor to be before the king of Jacksengard. It was Duke Kael Teroin. There was a matter that needed the king's attention. For his good luck, Roten always liked me. It made him change his mood. He shows him some important documents, but he doesn't even read them. He knew that he could take care of that. His duty was to protect defenseless citizens. That was not his task. Outside the city of Jacksengard, in the western zone, the protagonist was arriving with his companions. He had bought a house before leaving for the other world. The blonde could not believe it. The protagonist was very cunning. He knew that if they stayed in a hotel they would attract the attention of others. The house would be their temporary base. Zanan agreed with the protagonist, but he was not happy with the idea of the protagonist staying in a place like that. He could have sold his house to avoid that, if the future were seen, but it was completely ignored. The protagonist and the blonde entered the house. It had been uninhabited for a long time. It was as bad as they were imagining, but it would serve as a secret base to avoid raising suspicions. I just had to clean it up a bit. While the protagonist and Alita looked at the panorama, Zanan thought that the place was full of ghosts. They couldn't stay in a place like this. He was very upset with that place, so he makes the protagonist and the blonde leave the house to see beginning cleaning. He was making strange noises, but the house was as good as new. He tells the protagonist that everything was ready. It was a house with a poor appearance, but it had completely changed its appearance. Sihan was impressed. The only thing they had to do was find some furniture and it would be perfect. Apparently Zanan was obsessed with cleanliness. Alita, on the other hand, thinks that she should dirty things in a fight against him. With that she could win the match. They were ready to start. It was time to take care of the protagonist's first target, the weakest of all, the king of Jacksengard. Sihan was strongly betrayed by his friends. He wanted to find out the real reason. He was willing to take revenge, eliminating each of the 6 heroes. He would easily defeat the king of Jacksengard, which will be the #1 test subject that matters so much to Sihan Lilstein. If you want to know more about this incredible manhwa, don't forget to leave a good like.